The year was 1941. America had just been struck at Pearl Harbor, and overnight, fear consumed the nation. Neighbors turned suspicious, headlines screamed of spies and sabotage, and soon an entire community was branded as the enemy within. Nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans, men, women, and children, were torn from their homes, forced into dusty camps, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. They lost farms, businesses, schools, and the simple dignity of freedom. They were Americans in name, but prisoners in reality. And yet, out of this injustice rose a decision that would change history. Thousands of young Japanese American men volunteered to fight for the very country that had caged their families. They formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit that would storm battlefields across Europe, shatter enemy lines, and earn more medals than any other unit of its size in U.S. military history. This is a story of betrayal and courage, of sacrifice made in silence, of families who suffered behind fences while sons spilled blood on foreign soil. It is a story America tried to forget, yet one we must remember. Because only by remembering can we honor the bravery of those who proved that loyalty is not measured by skin or ancestry, but by sacrifice and heart. So how did prisoners of America become its bravest soldiers? Tonight, we walk through their struggle, their sacrifice, and their triumph. This is the story of the forgotten heroes who still fought for America. And before we begin, if you believe stories like this must never be lost, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us keep history alive, one untold story at a time. Now, let's begin. The attack on Pearl Harbor and rising suspicion. Fade in on December 7th, 1941. The morning sun rises over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, casting golden light across the Pacific Fleet, anchored in neat rows. The scene is deceptively peaceful. Sailors going about their Sunday morning routines, unaware that in mere moments, their world will be shattered forever. Then, the sound, a distant hum that grows into a roar. Japanese warplanes appear on the horizon like a dark cloud descending upon the harbor. The attack is swift and devastating. Explosions tear through battleships. The USS Arizona erupts in a fireball that can be seen for miles. Black smoke billows into the once clear sky. Men scramble, some still in their pajamas, trying to make sense of the chaos. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans lie dead, nearly 1,200 wounded, and the Pacific Fleet crippled. The attack isn't just a military strike, it's a psychological earthquake that will reshape the entire nation. Back on the mainland, word spreads like wildfire. Radio broadcasts interrupt regular programming with urgent news bulletins. Families gather around their radios, faces pale with shock and fear. President Franklin D. Roosevelt will call it a date which will live in infamy. But for Japanese Americans living across the United States, it becomes something far more personal and terrifying. It becomes the moment their lives as they know them begin to crumble. In California, Oregon, and Washington, where the majority of Japanese Americans have built their lives, the mood shifts dramatically within hours. Issei, the first-generation immigrants from Japan, and their American-born children, the Nisei, suddenly find themselves viewed through a lens of suspicion and fear. These are people who have lived in America for decades, who own businesses, farms, and homes. They've raised their children as Americans, sent them to American schools, pledged allegiance to the American flag. But now, overnight, their faces mark them as potential enemies. The suspicion manifests in immediate and tangible ways. Japanese American store owners arrive at their shops to find windows smashed, racist graffiti painted across walls. Jap becomes a slur shouted on the streets. Fishermen are barred from their boats, accused of potentially signaling enemy submarines. Teachers and doctors lose their jobs. Banks freeze accounts. The FBI begins rounding up community leaders, Buddhist priests, Japanese language teachers, anyone deemed potentially dangerous, often based on nothing more than their prominence in the community. Young Nisei soldiers already serving in the U.S. military find themselves suddenly distrusted by their own units. Some are discharged. Others are reassigned away from combat roles. Daniel Inoue, who will later become a decorated war hero and U.S. Senator, recalls the moment he tried to volunteer for medical duty after Pearl Harbor, only to be turned away by a recruiter who looked at his face and said, "You're a Jap." The newspapers fan the flames of hysteria. Headlines scream about the yellow peril and potential saboteurs among Japanese American communities. Editorials call for action, for protection, for removal. The fact that not a single act of sabotage or espionage by Japanese Americans has been documented doesn't matter. Fear doesn't require facts. Popular columnist Henry McLemore writes in the San Francisco Examiner, "I am for the immediate removal of every Japanese on the West Coast to a point deep in the interior. Herd 'em up, pack 'em off." Military leaders add their voices to the chorus. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, commanding general of the Western Defense Command, testifies that the Japanese race is an enemy race, making no distinction between citizens and non-citizens, between those born in Japan and those born in America. He argues that the very fact no sabotage has occurred is proof of a conspiracy, that Japanese Americans are simply waiting for the right moment to strike. The logic is circular, damning, and deadly in its implications. For Japanese American families, the weeks following Pearl Harbor become a nightmare of uncertainty. Parents try to explain to their children why neighbors no longer speak to them, why classmates call them names, why their father has been taken away by men in suits. They burn family heirlooms with Japanese writing, destroy photographs connecting them to Japan, even get rid of kimonos and dolls, anything that might be seen as evidence of disloyalty. They're trying to prove their Americanness by erasing their heritage, a heartbreaking calculus born of desperation. The irony is devastating. Many of these families have sons who want nothing more than to serve their country, to prove their loyalty through military service. But now they're classified as 4C by the Selective Service, enemy aliens, ineligible to serve. Young men who've grown up playing baseball, attending American schools, dreaming American dreams, are suddenly told they're not American enough to defend the nation they call home. Executive Order 9066 and the internment camps. On February 19, 1942, just over 2 months after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066. The document itself is brief, bureaucratic in its language, never explicitly mentioning Japanese Americans. It simply authorizes military commanders to designate military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. But everyone knows exactly what it means and who it targets. The order gives Lieutenant General DeWitt sweeping powers to remove anyone he deems a threat from the West Coast. Within weeks, notices appear on telephone poles, in post offices, on community bulletin boards, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. They read, families are given as little as 48 hours to a week to prepare for removal. They can bring only what they can carry. Everything else, homes, businesses, farms, possessions, accumulated over lifetimes, must be sold, stored, or abandoned. The scale of what's being asked, what's being commanded, is staggering. Approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens by birth, are to be removed from their homes and relocated to what the government euphemistically calls assembly centers, and then relocation centers. The reality is far bleaker. They're being sent to prison camps in America's most desolate regions simply because of their ancestry. Families scramble to decide what to do. Some sell their properties for pennies on the dollar to opportunistic buyers who know these people are desperate. A family grocery store built over 20 years goes for a few $100s. Farms worth thousands are sold for almost nothing. Others entrust their homes and businesses to friends or neighbors hoping those relationships will survive the separation. Many will return years later to find everything gone, stolen, or destroyed. The assembly process begins in the spring of 1942. Families report to designated areas, carrying suitcases and bundles, children clutching toys or pets they'll soon have to leave behind. They're tagged with numbers, like luggage, reducing their identities to digits on cardboard tags hanging from their coats. Armed soldiers supervise the boarding of trains and buses. Blinds on the transport vehicles are often drawn, preventing those inside from seeing where they're going, and preventing those outside from seeing the human cargo being transported through American towns and cities. The assembly centers are temporary facilities, often converted racetracks and fairgrounds. Families are housed in horse stables at places like Santa Anita and Tanforan. The smell of manure still lingers. Privacy is non-existent. Entire families occupy single stalls, separated from neighbors by thin partitions that don't reach the ceiling. Communal bathrooms and showers offer no privacy. The food is institutional and unfamiliar. This is America in 1942, treating its own citizens like prisoners of war. From these assembly centers, families are eventually transferred to 10 permanent relocation centers scattered across remote areas of California, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Arkansas. The camps are built in some of the harshest environments imaginable: the scorching deserts of Arizona, the freezing winters of Wyoming, the swamplands of Arkansas. They're surrounded by barbed wire fences and watched over by guard towers with armed sentries. The message is clear: you are prisoners, even if the government refuses to use that word. The conditions in these camps are harsh and dehumanizing. Families live in hastily constructed tar paper barracks, single rooms measuring about 20 by 25 feet, expected to house entire families. Gaps in the floorboards let in dust, sand, and cold. In winter, temperatures plummet, and the coal stoves provided offer little relief. In summer, the heat becomes unbearable, with no air conditioning and limited shade. At Manzanar in California, dust storms are so fierce they blacken the sky and fill every crevice with fine sand. At Minidoka in Idaho, winter temperatures drop well below zero. The communal nature of camp life strips away dignity and independence. Families eat in mess halls, wait in long lines for laundry facilities, share bathrooms with dozens of others. Parents struggle to maintain authority over their children in this environment. Traditional family structures begin to break down as young people spend more time with their peers than their parents. Elders, who commanded respect in Japanese culture, find their status diminished in a system that values only what the camp administration decides is important. Yet amid this injustice, communities form. People create schools for their children, often better than what was available in their previous rural areas. They organize sports leagues, art classes, musical performances. They plant gardens, transforming barren landscapes into places of beauty. They publish camp newspapers, hold elections for camp councils, create a semblance of normal civic life behind barbed wire. This resilience, this determination to maintain humanity and dignity in the face of such injustice, becomes one of the most remarkable aspects of the internment experience. But the psychological toll is immense. Children grow up not understanding why they're imprisoned, why armed guards watch them, why their parents seem powerless to protect them. Parents grapple with shame, anger, and helplessness. Many internees develop the philosophy of shikata ga nai. It cannot be helped, a Japanese expression of resignation. But beneath that surface, acceptance often churns deep bitterness and trauma that will last for generations. The economic devastation is equally severe. Japanese Americans lose an estimated $400 million in property and income, equivalent to billions in today's currency. Businesses built over decades vanish. Family heirlooms are lost or stolen. Generational wealth accumulated through hard work and sacrifice simply evaporates. The internment doesn't just imprison bodies, it destroys economic futures and transfers wealth from a vulnerable minority to those willing to exploit their misfortune. The question of loyalty. Within the camps, the question of loyalty becomes both a philosophical crisis and a practical nightmare. How does one prove loyalty to a nation that has imprisoned you? How do you swear allegiance to a government that has stripped away your rights? These questions aren't merely theoretical. They become brutally concrete in early 1943, when the government administers what becomes known as the Loyalty Questionnaire. The questionnaire is officially called the Statement of United States Citizen of Japanese Ancestry and the Application for Leave Clearance. It contains 28 questions designed to assess the loyalty of internees and determine their eligibility for resettlement outside the camps or service in the military. But two questions, numbers 27 and 28, become lightning rods for controversy and tear apart families and communities. Question 27 asks, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty, wherever ordered? Question 28 asks, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? These questions seem straightforward to those administering them, but for the internees, they're loaded with painful contradictions and impossible choices. For the Issei, the first-generation immigrants who were prohibited by law from becoming American citizens, answering yes to question 28 means forswearing allegiance to Japan and becoming stateless, people without a country. For the Nisei, American citizens imprisoned by their own government, swearing unqualified allegiance to a nation that treats them as enemies feels like a cruel joke. Young men face an agonizing decision. If they answer yes to question 27, they volunteer to fight for a country that has imprisoned their families. If they answer no, they're labeled disloyal and potentially subject to even harsher treatment or segregation. Some see military service as the only way to prove their loyalty and secure better treatment for their families. Others view it as a betrayal, arguing that they shouldn't have to earn rights that should already be theirs as American citizens. The questionnaire fractures communities. Families argue bitterly over how to answer. Parents plead with their sons to answer yes, yes, believing it's the only path to eventual freedom. Sons rage against the injustice of having to prove their loyalty while imprisoned. Some answer no, no, as a form of protest, refusing to cooperate with a system that has violated their constitutional rights. These no-no boys will later be sent to a segregation center at Tule Lake, California, branded as disloyal and subjected to even harsher conditions. The controversy over the questionnaire reveals deep philosophical divides within the Japanese-American community. Some, particularly the older Issei, counsel accommodation and patience, believing that compliance is the path to eventual vindication. Others, particularly younger Nisei, argue that their rights shouldn't be conditional, that they shouldn't have to prove their loyalty to enjoy the constitutional protections promised to all America. The Japanese American Citizens League, JACL, the primary civil rights organization for Japanese Americans, strongly advocates for answering yes, yes, and cooperating with the government. JACL leaders argue that military service will prove Japanese American loyalty and help secure better treatment after the war. But this position makes them deeply unpopular with many internees who view the JACL as collaborators, helping the government enforce unjust policies. The split over the loyalty questions creates wounds that will last for decades. Families stop speaking to each other. Friends become enemies. Communities that had been united in facing discrimination and prejudice now turn against their own members over how to respond to imprisonment. Those who volunteer for military service are sometimes called inu, dogs, traitors to their own people. Those who resist are called cowards or troublemakers, putting everyone else at risk. For young men deciding whether to volunteer, the decision is agonizing on multiple levels. They're being asked to potentially die for a country that has stripped their families of freedom, property, and dignity. Yet many are deeply patriotic, raised to believe in American ideals, even if America hasn't lived up to those ideals for them. They want to prove that Japanese Americans are loyal, that they deserve to be treated as equals. Some feel that military service is the only way to redeem their family's honor and secure a future in America. The psychological burden is immense. These young men know that if they volunteer, they'll be fighting while their parents, siblings, and grandparents remain imprisoned behind barbed wire. They'll be risking their lives for a country that considers their families a threat. The cognitive dissonance is almost unbearable, yet thousands will make the choice to serve, driven by complex motivations that mix patriotism, pragmatism, pride, and hope for a better future, choosing to fight for the same nation that imprisoned them. The decision to volunteer for military service from behind barbed wire represents one of the most extraordinary and complicated acts of loyalty in American history. It's not a simple story of patriotism. It's a story of young men making impossible choices in impossible circumstances, driven by a complex mix of motivations that even they sometimes struggle to articulate. In January 1943, the War Department reverses its earlier policy and announces it will accept Japanese American volunteers for a segregated combat unit. The announcement comes after months of lobbying by Japanese American leaders who argue that military service will prove their community's loyalty. It's also driven by practical military needs. The war isn't going well, and the military needs more soldiers. The Army sets a goal of recruiting 3,000 volunteers from Hawaii and 1,500 from the mainland camps. The response from Hawaii is enthusiastic. Over saying, null Hawaiian Nisei volunteer, far exceeding expectations. In Hawaii, where Japanese Americans comprise over a third of the population and weren't subjected to mass incarceration, the context is different. They're defending their home, proving their loyalty on their own terms. But on the mainland, in the camps, the response is much more complicated. Recruiters visit the camps with patriotic speeches and promises of glory. They tell the young men that this is their chance to prove their loyalty, to show America that Japanese Americans are willing to fight and die for their country. But these speeches often fall flat in front of audiences of imprisoned citizens. How can you ask someone to die for freedom while denying them that very freedom? The contradiction is too stark, too painful to ignore. Yet despite the bitter irony, despite the anger and the betrayal, volunteers do come forward. About 1,200 mainland internees initially volunteer, less than the Army hoped, but remarkable given the circumstances. These men have different reasons for their choice. Some are driven by pure patriotism, a love of country that survives even imprisonment. They believe in America's ideals, even when America fails to live up to them. They want to prove that those ideals are worth fighting for. Others volunteer out of pragmatism. They believe that military service is the only path to improving conditions for their families and securing a future for Japanese Americans in the United States. They calculate that battlefield sacrifice will purchase political rights and social acceptance. It's a terrible bargain, trading blood for citizenship that should already be theirs, but it's the only bargain available. Many are driven by a sense of obligation to their families and community. In Japanese culture, there's a strong concept of on, a debt of gratitude to parents and community that must be repaid. Some young men volunteer not because they believe in America, but because they believe their service will protect their families and honor their parents' sacrifices. They're not fighting for the country that imprisoned them. They're fighting for the people they love who remain imprisoned. Still others volunteer to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the camps. Life behind barbed wire is psychologically crushing, and military service, even with its dangers, offers a way out, a chance to take control of their own fate. Better to die free on a battlefield than live as a prisoner in your own country. It's a grim calculation, but for some, it's the only one that makes sense. The volunteers face intense pressure from all sides. Families beg them not to go, terrified of losing their sons. Other internees condemn them as traitors or fools. Yet they persist, driven by their own complex reasoning and their own sense of what honor demands. Many can't fully explain their decision even to themselves. When asked years later why they volunteered from behind barbed wire, many struggle to articulate clear reasons. It was just something they felt they had to do. The volunteers also face resistance from within the military establishment. Many officers don't want to command Japanese-American troops, viewing them as potential security risks or simply inferior soldiers. There are serious discussions about whether these men can be trusted with weapons, whether they'll fight or defect to the enemy. It's another layer of insult, added to the injury of having to prove their loyalty at all. But the volunteers press forward, determined to serve despite all obstacles. They undergo the humiliation of taking loyalty oaths, of being watched more carefully than other recruits, of facing suspicion from the very institution they're volunteering to serve. They endure racist comments from fellow soldiers and officers who make clear they're not welcome. Yet they persist, understanding that they're not just fighting for themselves. They're fighting for their families, their community, their future in America. As they prepare to leave the camps for training, the volunteers face painful goodbyes. Parents put on brave faces, trying not to show their fear and heartbreak. Siblings try to understand why their brother is leaving them behind. Friends argue one last time about whether this is courage or foolishness. In the end, the volunteers board buses that will take them away from the camps, trading one uncertain fate for another. These young men carry a burden no other American soldiers have to bear. They're fighting to prove their humanity, their worthiness, their right to be considered American. Every battle will be a test not just of military skill but of loyalty. Every casualty will be measured against whether the sacrifice was worth it. They're not just soldiers, they're ambassadors for their entire community, knowing that their failures will be attributed to their race and their successes will be treated as exceptions. Fade to black as the buses carrying volunteers disappear into the distance, leaving behind barbed wire and guard towers, heading toward an uncertain future where they'll have to prove their loyalty with blood. The call for volunteers. Fade in on a cold January morning in 1943. Inside the War Department in Washington, D.C., military officials and government administrators gather for a momentous decision. Secretary of War Henry Stimson stands before assembled officers and civilian leaders, announcing a policy reversal that will change the course of the war and the lives of thousands of Japanese-American men. The War Department will now accept volunteers from the mainland internment camps and Hawaii to form an all-Japanese-American combat unit. The announcement is carefully crafted, wrapped in the language of opportunity and democracy. Officials speak of giving Japanese Americans a chance to prove their loyalty, to demonstrate their commitment to American values. But beneath the patriotic rhetoric lies cold military calculation. The war is consuming manpower at an alarming rate. Casualties in North Africa and the Pacific are mounting. The draft is pulling men from farms and factories faster than they can be replaced. The military needs soldiers, and Japanese-American men represent an untapped resource. The decision to form a segregated unit rather than integrating Japanese Americans into existing units reveals the persistent prejudice within the military establishment. Officials argue that segregation is necessary for unit cohesion, that other soldiers won't accept Japanese Americans as comrades, that it's better to keep them separate. The irony is lost on no one in the Japanese American community. They're being asked to fight for a country that won't even allow them to fight alongside other Americans as equals. Mike Masaoka, National Secretary of the Japanese American Citizens League, becomes one of the primary advocates for the all-Nisei combat team. He travels to camps, giving impassioned speeches about duty, honor, and the opportunity to prove Japanese American loyalty through blood and sacrifice. This is our chance, he tells crowded barracks halls, to show America what we're made of, to prove once and for all that we are Americans in every sense of the word. His words inspire some but infuriate others, who see him as a collaborator, helping the government recruit soldiers from prison camps. The recruiting campaign begins in earnest in February 1943. Army recruiters arrive at the camps with crisp uniforms and practiced speeches. They set up tables in mess halls and recreation centers, displaying posters showing heroic soldiers in action. The message is clear and repeated. Military service is the path to redemption, to acceptance, to a future in America. But the recruiters quickly discover that selling military service to imprisoned men is far more complicated than recruiting on the outside. In Hawaii, where Japanese Americans weren't subjected to mass incarceration and made up a significant portion of the population, the response is overwhelming. Over 10,000 men volunteer, far exceeding the military's quota. These Hawaiian Nisei are eager to defend their home, to prove that their loyalty was never in question. They come from plantation workers' families, from Honolulu's middle class, from fishing villages and sugarcane fields. They're united by a determination to show that Japanese Americans are as American as anyone else. But on the mainland, inside the barbed wire camps, the response is dramatically different. The first meetings between recruiters and potential volunteers are tense, sometimes hostile. Young men stand in the back of rooms with arms crossed, faces hard with anger and suspicion. They ask pointed questions that recruiters struggle to answer. Why should we fight for a country that imprisoned our families? Will our parents be freed if we serve? Are we fighting for freedom while our own freedom is denied? The recruiters have no good answers to these questions. They can't promise that families will be released from the camps. They can't explain the contradiction of asking imprisoned citizens to risk their lives for freedom. They fall back on appeals to duty, patriotism, and the promise of post-war opportunities. But these promises ring hollow in the drafty barracks halls of Manzanar, Minidoka, and Heart Mountain. Despite the anger and skepticism, volunteers do come forward. They're young men wrestling with impossible choices, motivated by complex and sometimes contradictory feelings. Some are driven by genuine patriotism that survives even imprisonment. Others see military service as the only path to improving their families' situations. Many feel an obligation to their parents and community, believing that their sacrifice might secure better treatment for everyone left behind. The volunteers face intense pressure from all directions. Parents beg them not to go, having already lost homes, businesses, and freedom, terrified of losing their sons as well. Some mothers refuse to speak to sons who volunteer, viewing it as a betrayal. Other internees condemn volunteers as traitors or dupes, collaborating with their own oppression. Pro-resistance groups within the camps denounce military service as accepting the legitimacy of their imprisonment. Yet the volunteers persist. By the end of the recruitment period, about 1,200 mainland internees have volunteered, falling short of the Army's goal, but remarkable given the circumstances. Each volunteer has his own story, his own reasons. 20-year-old Fred Shiosaki from Spokane volunteers because he wants to prove that his family deserves to return home. Daniel Inoue from Hawaii joins because he believes in America's promise even when America fails to deliver. Sadao Munemori from Los Angeles enlists hoping his service will help his mother leave the camp. The volunteers fill out paperwork, take loyalty oaths, and undergo medical examinations, all under the watchful eyes of armed guards who still treat them as prisoners. They're issued temporary passes to leave the camps for military service, a bitter reminder that their freedom is conditional, granted not as a right, but as a privilege that can be revoked. They pack their few belongings, say painful goodbyes to families left behind, and board buses that will take them away from barbed wire toward an uncertain military future. As the buses roll out of the camps, the volunteers look back at their families standing behind fences, waving goodbye. Some parents stand stoically, maintaining the Japanese cultural expectation of emotional restraint. Others openly weep, unable to hide their fear and grief. Younger siblings wave enthusiastically, not fully understanding that their brothers might never return. The volunteers wave back, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of determination, fear, doubt, and hope. The journey from the camps to the training facility will take several days, carrying the volunteers across a country that largely doesn't want them. They travel through towns where signs in windows still read, "No Japs allowed," where people stare at them with hostility or curiosity. They're leaving one form of confinement for another, trading prison camps for military bases. But at least they're moving forward, taking action, choosing their fate rather than having it imposed upon them. Training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The trains and buses carrying Japanese-American volunteers from Hawaii and the mainland camps converge on Camp Shelby, Mississippi, in the spring of 1943. Camp Shelby, located in the piney woods near Hattiesburg in southern Mississippi, will become the training ground for what will officially be designated the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The camp is a sprawling military installation covering thousands of acres, with row upon row of wooden barracks, training fields, obstacle courses, and firing ranges. The arrival of the Hawaiian and mainland contingents creates immediate tension. The Hawaiian soldiers, who numbered over 9,000 men, selected from the original 10,000 volunteers, arrive first. They're confident, boisterous, and proud. Most come from working-class backgrounds, plantation laborers and dock workers who speak pidgin English and carry themselves with the easy swagger of men who've never been imprisoned for their ancestry. They view themselves as Americans defending their home, and they're eager to prove themselves in combat. When the mainland soldiers arrive, the Hawaiians are shocked. These kotonks, as the Hawaiians call them, using a term that mimics the sound of a coconut hitting the ground, are different. They're quieter, more reserved, carrying the psychological weight of their family's imprisonment. Many are better educated, more middle class in background, but they lack the Hawaiians' confident American identity. The Hawaiians view them as too Japanese, too willing to accept mistreatment. The mainland soldiers view the Hawaiians as loud, undisciplined, and unable to understand what it means to be treated as enemies in your own country. The cultural clash between the two groups is immediate and sometimes violent. Fistfights break out in barracks and mess halls. The Hawaiians mock the mainlanders for being too serious, too formal, too Japanese in their manners. The mainlanders resent the Hawaiians' carefree attitude, their inability to understand the trauma of internment. The term Buddha head becomes the mainlanders' slur for Hawaiians, referencing their supposedly thick skulls. The two groups self-segregate, eating at different tables, socializing separately, viewing each other with mutual suspicion and resentment. The officers overseeing the 442nd are almost entirely white, and many arrive with serious doubts about the unit they're being asked to command. Some request transfers, not wanting to lead Japanese-American soldiers. Others accept the assignment, but make their prejudices clear through comments and behavior. They wonder if these men can be trusted with weapons, if they'll fight effectively, if Japanese cultural values of obedience to authority will translate into good soldiers or merely submissive ones who'll break under pressure. But there are exceptions. Lieutenant Colonel James Gillespie, who becomes the unit's first commander, approaches his assignment with professionalism and an open mind. He's a career officer who judges soldiers by their performance, not their ancestry. He sees potential in these men and begins the difficult work of transforming civilians and draftees into an effective fighting force. Other officers follow his lead, putting aside prejudices to focus on training. The training regimen at Camp Shelby is brutal and comprehensive. The 442nd soldiers wake before dawn for calisthenics and run, do push-ups and sit-ups until their muscles scream. They learn to march in formation, to handle weapons, to dig foxholes and set up defensive positions. They crawl through mud under barbed wire while machine guns fire live ammunition overhead. They practice hand-to-hand combat, bayonet charges, and night maneuvers. The training is designed to prepare them for the reality of combat, and the instructors don't hold back. Physical training is only part of the preparation. The soldiers learn military tactics, map reading, radio communication, and first aid. They practice coordinating infantry movements with artillery support. They learn how to assault fortified positions, how to conduct patrols, how to survive in enemy territory. The training is intense and relentless, pushing the men to their physical and mental limits. For many of the soldiers, particularly those from the mainland camps, the training provides a welcome sense of purpose and normalcy. After months or years of idle confinement behind barbed wire, the demanding physical and mental challenges of military training feel liberating. They're being treated like soldiers, evaluated on their performance rather than their ancestry. When they succeed in training exercises, the satisfaction is profound. They're proving to themselves and their instructors that they're capable, competent, worthy of respect. The turning point in relations between the Hawaiian and mainland soldiers comes during a weekend pass to nearby Hattiesburg. A group of Hawaiian soldiers decides to visit one of the camps where mainland soldiers' families are imprisoned. They expect to find something like the accommodations they had in Hawaii before volunteering. Maybe modest, but decent housing. Instead, they encounter the harsh reality of the internment camps for the first time. They see the barbed wire fences, the guard towers, the armed sentries watching over American citizens. They see families living in cramped barracks with no privacy, eating institutional food in mess halls, using communal latrines. They meet the parents and siblings of their fellow soldiers, seeing the fear and hope in these families' eyes when they talk about their sons in uniform. They realize that their Kotonk comrades are fighting while their families remain imprisoned. That every day in uniform is a day of divided loyalty and heartbreak. The experience transforms the Hawaiian soldiers' understanding and attitude. They return to Camp Shelby subdued and thoughtful. The mocking stops. The fights cease. They begin reaching out to the mainland soldiers with new respect and empathy. Slowly, painfully, the two groups begin to merge into a single unit. Hawaiians teach mainlanders to relax, to laugh, to embrace life with more joy. Mainlanders teach Hawaiians about the depth of discrimination Japanese Americans face, about resilience in the face of injustice. Friendships form across the cultural divide. Hawaiian soldiers share care packages from home with mainlanders whose families have nothing to send. Mainland soldiers help Hawaiians with paperwork and military protocol they find confusing. They begin to see each other not as Buddha heads and kotonks, but as brothers facing the same challenges, carrying the same burden of proving Japanese American worth through military service. The racial climate in Mississippi adds another dimension to the soldiers' experience. The Deep South in 1943 is deeply segregated, with Jim Crow laws enforcing strict separation between white and black populations. The Japanese American soldiers find themselves in an ambiguous racial category. Some white establishments refuse them service, viewing them as non-white and therefore unworthy. Others, perhaps seeing them as exotic foreigners rather than local minorities, allow them entry. The soldiers witness and experience Southern racism firsthand. They see black soldiers forced to use separate facilities, treated with contempt by white civilians and even some white officers. Some Japanese American soldiers are mistaken for Chinese and treated better when they clarify their nationality, revealing the arbitrary nature of racial prejudice. The experience gives them a deeper understanding of American racism's complexity and helps them connect their own struggle for equality with the broader civil rights movement. Building the motto, "Go for broke." Out of the grueling training and growing unit cohesion emerges the motto that will define the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, "Go for broke." The phrase comes from Hawaiian pidgin slang, a gambling term meaning to risk everything, to wager all you have on a single bet. For the men of the 442nd, the motto becomes more than just catchy military slang. It becomes a philosophy, a commitment, a promise that they'll hold nothing back in proving their loyalty and worth. The exact origin of the motto is disputed. lost in the informal conversations and bull sessions where soldiers bonded and shared their hopes and fears. Some credit the Hawaiian soldiers who brought the phrase from the islands. Others remember it emerging organically from discussions about what the unit should stand for. Regardless of its precise origin, Go for Broke captures something essential about the 442nd's mission and mindset. For these soldiers, half measures aren't an option. They understand that they're not just fighting for military objectives, they're fighting for their family's freedom, for their community's future, for their right to be considered fully American. Every battle is a referendum on Japanese-American loyalty. Every casualty will be measured against whether the sacrifice was worth it. They can't afford to be merely adequate soldiers. They have to be exceptional, to exceed every expectation, to prove beyond any doubt that Japanese Americans deserve equality and respect. The motto, Go for Broke, embodies this determination to give everything, to hold nothing in reserve. It's a declaration that they'll fight with total commitment, that they won't retreat or surrender, that they'll complete their mission regardless of cost. It's both inspiring and tragic, a promise that will lead to extraordinary heroism, but also devastating casualties. They're betting everything, their lives, their futures, their families' hopes on a single gamble. That battlefield sacrifice will purchase the acceptance and rights that should already be theirs. The adoption of Go for Broke as the official unit motto happens formally but grows organically from the soldiers' shared understanding of their mission. Officers recognize that the phrase captures the unit's spirit and makes it official. Soon, it appears on unit patches and insignia, alongside the unit's numerical designation. Soldiers begin using it as a greeting, a battle cry, a reminder of their shared commitment. Go for Broke becomes shorthand for everything the 442nd represents. The motto also serves a practical purpose in building unit cohesion and morale. Training is exhausting and sometimes demoralizing. The soldiers face discrimination from some officers and fellow soldiers at Camp Shelby. They receive letters from families still imprisoned in camps, reminding them of the injustice they're fighting to overcome. The motto gives them something to rally around, a shared identity and purpose that transcends individual doubts and fears. During training exercises, Go for Broke becomes a challenge and inspiration. When soldiers are exhausted from a forced march, when they're tempted to give up during a grueling obstacle course, when they're cold and wet and miserable during night maneuvers, they remind each other to go for broke. The motto pushes them to exceed what they thought were their limits, to prove to themselves and their instructors that they're capable of extraordinary effort and performance. The psychological dimension of the motto is complex. On one level, it's empowering, giving the soldiers agency and purpose. They're choosing to give everything, making a conscious decision to prove their worth through exceptional performance. But on another level, it's tragic, revealing the unfair burden placed on these men. No other American soldiers have to go for broke just to prove their basic humanity and loyalty. No other unit has to risk everything just to secure rights that should be guaranteed by citizenship. Some soldiers embrace the motto with enthusiasm, viewing it as a path to glory and vindication. Others accept it more grimly, understanding it as a necessary bargain in an unjust situation. A few quietly resent it, recognizing that go for broke essentially promises they'll accept casualties and sacrifice that wouldn't be expected of other units. But regardless of individual feelings, the motto becomes the defining characteristic of the 442nd, the standard by which they'll judge themselves and be judged by others. The motto gains additional meaning as the soldiers near the end of their training. They know deployment to a combat zone is approaching. Abstract discussions about loyalty and sacrifice are about to become concrete reality. Go for broke transforms from a training slogan into a commitment that will be tested under fire. The soldiers begin writing letters home, sometimes mentioning the motto, trying to explain to families what it means and why they've embraced it. For parents still imprisoned in the camps, hearing their sons talk about going for broke provokes complex emotions: pride, mixes with terror. They're proud their sons are willing to serve, to prove the family's loyalty. But they're terrified of losing them, of sacrificing their children to a country that has already taken so much. The motto sounds brave and noble in letters, but to worried parents, it sounds like a death wish, a promise of casualties that might not come home. The final weeks of training at Camp Shelby are intense. The soldiers conduct large-scale exercises, simulating combat conditions. They practice coordinated attacks with live ammunition, learning to trust each other under pressure. The officers evaluate their readiness, identifying strengths and weaknesses. The 442nd is being transformed from a collection of individuals into a cohesive fighting unit, bound together by shared purpose and the motto they've embraced. As training concludes, the unit receives its official insignia and shoulder patch. The patch features a torch of liberty, with the motto, "Go for broke," emblazoned beneath it. The torch symbolizes enlightenment and freedom, the very values these soldiers are fighting to secure for themselves and their families. When they sew the patches onto their uniforms, it's a moment of pride and anxiety. They're now officially the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, ready to go for broke on the battlefields of Europe. First deployments to Europe. In May 1944, after over a year of intensive training at Camp Shelby, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team receives its deployment orders. They're heading to Europe, specifically to Italy, where Allied forces are pushing north against stubborn German resistance. The announcement brings a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Finally, they'll have the chance to prove themselves in combat, to demonstrate that their training and commitment weren't in vain. But they're also heading into real danger, where bullets are live and casualties inevitable. The journey to Europe is long and uncomfortable. The soldiers board troop ships at East Coast ports, crowding into the cargo holds where hammock-style bunks are stacked 4 high and space is precious. The Atlantic crossing takes over a week, with many soldiers experiencing seasickness for the first time. They while away the hours playing cards, writing letters home, checking and rechecking their equipment, trying not to think too much about what awaits them. During the crossing, officers brief the soldiers on the tactical situation in Italy. The Italian campaign has been grinding on since the Allied invasion in September 1943. After liberating Sicily, Allied forces invaded mainland Italy, expecting quick progress. Instead, they've encountered fierce German resistance, particularly along defensive lines in the mountainous terrain of central Italy. The Germans have established strong positions, using Italy's natural geography to slow the Allied advance to a crawl. The 442nd will be entering a brutal campaign characterized by mountain warfare, where every ridge and valley must be fought for, where artillery and air support are often ineffective against dug-in defenders, where infantry soldiers bear the heaviest burden. The officers don't sugarcoat the challenges ahead. They'll be facing experienced German troops who've been fighting for years. Soldiers who know how to use terrain and fortifications to maximum advantage. The casualty rates in Italy are high, higher than in many other theaters of the war. As the troop ships approach Europe, the soldiers spend more time on deck, watching the coastline emerge from the horizon. For many, it's their first time leaving the United States. They're traveling thousands of miles from home to fight for a country that has imprisoned their families in a war against an enemy they've never seen, in terrain and conditions completely foreign to most of them. The strangeness of the situation isn't lost on them. The ships dock at Naples in late May 1944, and the soldiers get their first glimpse of war-torn Italy. Naples has been heavily bombed, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Civilians, many of them thin and desperate from years of war, crowd the docks looking for work or handouts. The destruction is sobering, making the war real in a way that training exercises never could. This is what modern warfare looks like: shattered buildings, displaced people, and infrastructure destroyed. From Naples, the 442nd moves north toward the front lines by truck convoy. The journey takes them through the Italian countryside, past ancient towns perched on hilltops, through valleys where farmers still tend their fields, despite the war raging nearby. The contrast between Italy's timeless beauty and the evidence of modern warfare is stark. They pass convoys of wounded soldiers heading to rear hospitals, see destroyed vehicles pushed to the sides of roads, hear the distant thunder of artillery. The 442nd's first assignment is to relieve the 100th Infantry Battalion, a separate unit of Japanese-American soldiers who've been fighting in Italy since September 1943. The 100th Battalion was formed before the 442nd, composed of Nisei soldiers from Hawaii, who were already in the military when Pearl Harbor happened. They've been fighting for months, earning a fierce reputation for bravery and effectiveness, but suffering heavy casualties in the process. When the 442nd meets the 100th Battalion, the encounter is emotional and revealing. The veterans of the 100th look hardened and exhausted, their uniforms worn and dirty, their eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of men who've seen too much combat. They welcome their reinforcements but also regard them with some skepticism. The 442nd soldiers are green, untested, their uniforms new and clean. The veterans wonder if these rookies understand what they're getting into, if they'll hold up when the shooting starts. The 100th Battalion veterans share stories and advice with the new arrivals. They describe what combat is really like, the noise and confusion, the way training disappears under fire and instinct takes over. They talk about keeping your head down, watching for mines and booby traps, never volunteering for anything. They show the newcomers how to dig proper foxholes, how to stay warm in the Italian mountains, how to make the most of limited rations. Some of their advice is practical. Some is dark humor, the kind soldiers use to cope with fear and loss. The decision is made to attach the 100th Battalion to the 442nd as a separate battalion, keeping its identity and designation, but operating as part of the larger Regimental Combat Team. This creates an unusual structure, with the 442nd technically including 4 battalions instead of the standard 3. The 100th retains its fierce pride and identity, but gains the reinforcement and support of the larger unit. Together, they'll form a formidable fighting force. The first days near the front line are tense for the untested soldiers of the 442nd. They hear artillery in the distance, see flares lighting up the night sky, listen to the sporadic crackle of small arms fire. They're issued live ammunition for the first time in combat conditions, each soldier checking his rifle and equipment repeatedly. Sleep is difficult. Every sound might be an enemy patrol, every shadow a potential threat. The veterans of the 100th watch the rookies with knowing expressions, remembering their own first days under fire. The 442nd's baptism by fire comes sooner than expected. In early June, they're ordered to conduct patrols in the hills near Suvareto, a small town in the coastal region of Tuscany. These patrols are designed to probe German positions, gather intelligence, and give the new troops experience under combat conditions before committing them to major operations. It's supposed to be a relatively gentle introduction to warfare, but there's nothing gentle about combat. The first patrol encounters German forces dug into defensive positions on a hillside. Suddenly, the theoretical training becomes terrifyingly real. Machine gun fire rips through the air. Mortar shells explode nearby, showering soldiers with dirt and shrapnel. Men who've trained together for over a year are now fighting for their lives, trying to remember their training while adrenaline and fear threaten to overwhelm reason. Some soldiers freeze momentarily, paralyzed by the shock of real combat. Others respond instinctively, moving and firing as trained. The patrol suffers its first casualties, men wounded by gunfire and shrapnel. The sound of wounded soldiers crying out for medics is something training can't fully prepare anyone for. Medics rush forward under fire to treat the wounded, demonstrating the courage that will become characteristic of the 442nd's medical personnel. Other soldiers provide covering fire, trying to suppress the German positions while wounded comrades are evacuated. When the patrol returns to friendly lines, the soldiers are shaken, but also transformed. They've experienced combat and survived. They've faced enemy fire and returned it. They've seen comrades wounded, but also witnessed incredible bravery and competence under pressure. The officers evaluate the patrol's performance and are generally pleased. The 442nd soldiers performed well for Green troops, maintaining discipline and effectiveness despite the shock of first combat. In the days that follow, the 442nd conducts more patrols and minor operations, gradually building combat experience and confidence. Each engagement teaches lessons that training couldn't fully convey. They learn to identify the sounds of different weapons, to estimate distances and positions by muzzle flashes and sound, to move quickly but carefully through terrain that might be mined or watched by snipers. They learn to function on minimal sleep, to eat when they can, to find moments of rest in the midst of danger. The soldiers also experience the grim reality of casualties. Men they trained with, ate with, became friends with, don't come back from patrols. Others return wounded, headed to hospitals and uncertain futures. The 442nd begins building its own casualty list, names added to a roster that will grow tragically long before the war ends. Each loss reinforces the unit's determination to make their sacrifices meaningful, to prove that Japanese Americans can fight and die as courageously as any other soldiers. Fade out as the 442nd settles into the rhythm of combat operations, transitioning from untested recruits to combat veterans, beginning to build the reputation that will eventually make them the most decorated unit in American military history. Arrival in Italy and the Battle of Anzio. Fade in on the rugged Italian landscape of summer 1944. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, now battle-hardened from their initial patrols and skirmishes, receives orders to move to a new sector of the Italian front. They're being sent to relieve exhausted units fighting in the hills and valleys of Tuscany, where the German Wehrmacht has established formidable defensive positions designed to slow the Allied advance to a crawl. The soldiers load onto trucks, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and the haunted look that comes from having already witnessed combat and lost comrades. The Italian campaign has become a brutal war of attrition, nothing like the rapid advances Allied commanders had envisioned when they first invaded the Italian peninsula. The Germans, under the brilliant and ruthless command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, have turned Italy's mountainous terrain into a defender's paradise. Every hill becomes a fortress, every valley a killing ground, every river crossing a costly operation. The Allies possess superior numbers and air power, but in the mountains, these advantages mean little. Infantry must take each position through direct assault, and the casualties mount with each yard gained. The 442nd's assignment takes them toward the Gothic Line, a series of German fortifications stretching across the northern Apennine Mountains. But before they reach those formidable defenses, they'll cut their teeth on smaller but no less dangerous operations. The town of Belvedere sits on a strategic hilltop, offering commanding views of the surrounding valleys. German forces have fortified the position with machine gun nests, artillery positions, and interconnected trenches. Taking Belvedere is the 442nd's first major objective, a test that will determine whether they can handle sustained combat operations. The attack begins in the pre-dawn darkness of late June 1944. The soldiers of the 442nd move through the Italian countryside, their equipment carefully muffled to avoid alerting German sentries. Artillery has pounded the German positions throughout the night, but as every infantryman knows, artillery alone never drives determined defenders from prepared positions. Someone has to go in and dig them out, and that someone is always the infantry. The soldiers check their weapons one final time, exchange quiet words of encouragement, and wait for the signal to advance. When the attack begins, the 442nd moves with the precision drilled into them at Camp Shelby. They advance in coordinated waves, using terrain for cover, providing suppressing fire as other elements maneuver. But textbook tactics meet the brutal reality of combat almost immediately. German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions, cutting down soldiers who moments before were advancing confidently. Mortar shells rained down, exploding among the advancing troops. The air fills with the sounds of warfare, the crack of rifles, the rattle of machine guns, the thunderous explosions of artillery, and underneath it all, the cries of wounded men calling for medics. Private First Class Sadao Munemori, a quiet young man from Los Angeles whose mother remains imprisoned at Manzanar, demonstrates the courage that will become characteristic of the 442nd. When his squad comes under heavy machine gun fire from a German position, Munemori volunteers to flank the enemy nest. He crawls through a hail of bullets, getting close enough to throw grenades that silence the German gun. His action allows his squad to advance, but it's just one small victory in a battle composed of hundreds of such desperate small unit actions. The fighting for Belvedere lasts for hours, each German strongpoint requiring a separate assault. The soldiers of the 442nd learn lessons that no training can fully teach. They learn that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action despite overwhelming fear. They learn that training and planning matter, but in combat, adaptability and quick thinking often make the difference between life and death. They learn to recognize the different sounds of incoming artillery, to judge when to dive for cover and when to keep advancing. They learn to function while exhausted, scared, and watching friends fall around them. By afternoon, the 442nd has secured Belvedere, driving the Germans from their positions through sustained assault. But the victory comes at a cost. The unit's casualty list grows significantly. Men killed outright by machine gun fire or artillery, others wounded and evacuated to field hospitals. Some so severely they'll never return to combat. The survivors dig in, knowing the Germans will counterattack, trying to recapture the strategic position. The counterattacks come that evening and continue through the night. Waves of German infantry trying to overwhelm the exhausted but determined defenders. The 442nd holds, repelling each counterattack with disciplined fire and determination. When German forces get close enough for hand-to-hand combat, the soldiers fight with rifles, bayonets, entrenching tools, anything at hand. The fighting is savage and personal, nothing like the distant, sanitized warfare of propaganda films. Men kill and die within arm's reach of each other. The intimate brutality of infantry combat, stripped of any pretense of glory or romance. The next weeks see the 442nd engaged in continuous combat operations across the Italian front. They attack fortified villages, conduct patrols through enemy-held territory, hold defensive positions against German counterattacks. Each operation adds to the unit's growing reputation for effectiveness and courage, but also to its casualty list. The soldiers become veterans in the truest sense. Men who've seen death repeatedly and learned to function despite it, who've lost friends and kept fighting, who've discovered reserves of courage and endurance they didn't know they possessed. The town of Livorno, a major port city on the western Italian coast, becomes the 442nd's next significant objective. The Germans have heavily fortified the approaches to the city, recognizing its strategic importance. The 442nd is tasked with breaking through these defenses as part of a larger Allied operation to capture the port and use it to supply the advancing armies. The battle for Livorno is intense and costly, involving street-to-street fighting in the city's outskirts, where every building becomes a potential strongpoint and every window a sniper's nest. Staff Sergeant Kazuo Masuda leads his squad through the rubble-strewn streets with exceptional skill and courage. When German forces pin down his platoon with machine gun fire from a fortified building, Masuda organizes a flanking maneuver, personally leading the assault that clears the position. His leadership and tactical skill save numerous lives and help secure the objective. Actions like Masuda's, repeated across the unit by scores of soldiers, build the 442nd's reputation as an elite fighting force. As July turns to August, The 442nd continues pushing north, part of the larger Allied drive toward the Gothic Line. The Italian summer is brutally hot, adding heat exhaustion and dehydration to the list of challenges soldiers face. They march and fight, carrying heavy equipment in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their water supplies never quite adequate. Veterans learn to pace themselves, to find shade during breaks, to share water with newer soldiers who haven't yet learned the art of conservation. The landscape they're fighting through is beautiful and deadly. Ancient Italian villages cling to hillsides, offering commanding views but also excellent defensive positions. Olive groves and vineyards provide cover for advancing troops, but also conceal mines and booby traps. Rivers and streams, dry or flowing depending on the season, create natural obstacles that must be crossed under fire. The soldiers of the 442nd learn to read this landscape, to identify likely enemy positions, to use terrain to their advantage. By late August, the 442nd has been in continuous combat for nearly 3 months. The unit has proven itself in battle repeatedly, earning praise from commanders and respect from other Allied units. But the cost has been severe. Casualties have significantly reduced the unit's strength. Faces that were present at the beginning of the campaign are gone, killed or wounded. Replacement soldiers arrive from the States, wide-eyed and nervous, and the veterans try to pass on the lessons they've learned, knowing that experience is the only real teacher in combat, but also knowing that learning through experience means some won't survive the education. The soldiers write letters home when they can, carefully worded to pass military censors and not worry families too much. They describe the Italian countryside's beauty but omit the combat's brutality. They ask about family members still imprisoned in the camps, trying to maintain connections with a life that seems increasingly distant and unreal. Some receive letters from parents who've been released from the camps, allowed to resettle in areas away from the West Coast. These letters bring joy mixed with bitterness. Their families are finally free, but only after these soldiers have bought that freedom with blood. The rescue of the lost battalion in France. Fade in on October 1944. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, after months of grueling combat in Italy, has been withdrawn from that front and redeployed to France. They arrive in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, a region of dense forests and steep ridges where Allied forces are pushing toward Germany itself. The autumn weather is turning cold and wet, a dramatic change from the Italian summer heat. The soldiers trade their light combat uniforms for heavier gear, preparing for what many sense will be their greatest test yet. The Vosges campaign has bogged down into fierce fighting. German forces defending their homeland's approaches resist with desperate determination. Every ridge and forest path becomes a battleground. The thick forests limit visibility and negate Allied advantages in artillery and air support. Infantry units find themselves fighting isolated actions, cut off from supporting elements, relying on their own resources and courage. It's in this challenging environment that the 442nd will write the most famous chapter of their story. In late October, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Infantry Division, pushes deep into German-held territory in an aggressive advance. The battalion, composed of about 275 men, pushes through the forest along a ridgeline, trying to break through German defenses. But the advance is a trap. German forces allow the battalion to penetrate their lines, then close behind them, surrounding the American unit completely. The battalion is cut off, trapped on a forested hillside, with no way to retreat and limited supplies. The surrounded battalion, which newspapers will soon dub the Lost Battalion, in echoes of a famous World War I incident, quickly finds itself in desperate circumstances. German forces probe their perimeter constantly, preventing any movement. Artillery and mortar fire rain down on their position. Casualties mount, but there's no way to evacuate the wounded. Food and water supplies dwindle. Medical supplies run out. Radio contact with friendly forces is intermittent and often jammed by the Germans. The trapped soldiers dig in, knowing their only hope is rescue, but having no idea when or if that rescue will come. The Allied command recognizes the severity of the situation. A battalion trapped behind enemy lines is both a tactical disaster and a propaganda nightmare. Multiple attempts are made to break through to the surrounded unit, but German defenses are too strong. Units try different approaches, different tactics, all with the same result: heavy casualties and no breakthrough. The Germans have fortified the ridges and valleys leading to the lost battalion, with interlocking fields of fire, mines, and dug-in positions. Each rescue attempt fails, adding to the casualty lists without reaching the trapped men. On October 25th, the 442nd receives its orders: break through to the lost battalion and rescue them. The mission is presented as an urgent priority, a task that must succeed despite the previous failures. The soldiers of the 442nd understand what they're being asked to do. They're being sent to accomplish what other units couldn't, to break through defenses that have already repulsed multiple attacks. They're being asked to go for broke in the most literal sense, to risk everything in a desperate rescue mission. The officers plan the attack carefully, studying maps and intelligence reports, identifying possible routes through the German defenses. But everyone knows that careful planning only goes so far. The terrain favors the defenders overwhelmingly. The forests limit maneuverability. The Germans hold the high ground and have had time to prepare their positions. The rescue will require courage, determination, and a willingness to accept casualties that would make most commanders hesitate. The attack begins on October 26th in cold, misty conditions that reduce visibility to yards. The 442nd advances into the forest, moving uphill through dense undergrowth and trees. Within minutes, they encounter German resistance. Machine gun fire cuts through the mist. Mortar shells explode among the trees, creating deadly shrapnel from splintered wood. The soldiers push forward, taking casualties, but maintaining momentum. They've been given a mission, and the motto "Go for broke" has never been more literal or more costly. The fighting is intense and personal. Visibility in the forest is so limited that combat often occurs. At ranges of 20 yards or less, soldiers fire at muzzle flashes and shapes in the mist. They advance by squad and platoon, using fire and maneuver tactics drilled into them at Camp Shelby, but now executed under the most difficult conditions imaginable. When German positions are identified, small groups of soldiers flank them, while others provide covering fire. It's textbook infantry tactics, but executing them under fire, in difficult terrain, while taking casualties, requires exceptional discipline and courage. Private First Class Barney Hajiro demonstrates extraordinary heroism during the advance. When his platoon comes under fire from multiple German machine gun positions, Hajiro single-handedly attacks the nearest position, destroying it with hand grenades. He then turns his captured German machine gun on a second position, silencing it as well. His actions allow his platoon to advance, but the cost is severe. Hajiro is wounded multiple times but refuses evacuation, continuing to fight until the objective is secured. The advance continues through October 27th and 28th. The 442nd pushes forward yard by yard, tree by tree. Each small gain purchased with blood. Casualties mount alarmingly. Companies that began the attack with over 100 men are reduced to 50, then 40. Officers and sergeants are hit, requiring junior soldiers to step into leadership roles they never expected. Medics work frantically to treat the wounded under fire, often becoming casualties themselves as they move through the battlefield, providing aid. The weather turns worse. Rain soaks the soldiers, making the already difficult terrain treacherous. The ground becomes mud, slowing movement and making resupply difficult. The cold seeps into exhausted bodies, sapping strength and morale. But the 442nd doesn't stop. They've been given a mission to rescue fellow soldiers, and they understand that the lost battalion situation grows more desperate with each passing hour. Men who are bone-tired, cold, wet, and scared push forward because their brothers need them. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama leads his squad in a critical assault on a German strongpoint, blocking the advance. The position is well defended, with interlocking fields of fire that have stopped previous attacks. Ohama organizes his squad for a coordinated assault using smoke grenades to obscure their movement. Under his leadership, the squad assaults the position from multiple directions, overwhelming the defenders in close combat. Ohama's tactical skill and courage open a crucial gap in the German defenses, allowing the advance to continue. By October 29th, after 5 days of continuous combat, the 442nd has pushed deep into German defenses. They're exhausted, reduced in strength, low on ammunition and supplies, but still moving forward. The trapped battalion is close now, perhaps just a few hundred yards away. But those final yards are defended as fiercely as any ground the 442nd has crossed. The Germans know what's happening and are determined to prevent the rescue, throwing everything they have at the advancing American forces. The breakthrough comes on October 30th. Elements of the 442nd finally reach the lost battalion's perimeter, linking up with the surrounded soldiers after 6 days of isolation and 5 days of brutal fighting to rescue them. The scene is emotional and stark. The rescued soldiers are in terrible condition, wounded, starving, some barely conscious. They've held out against overwhelming odds, and their relief at being rescued is palpable. But they're also shocked by the condition of their rescuers. The men of the 442nd look like ghosts, filthy, exhausted, many wounded themselves but still on their feet. The rescue operation isn't over. The 442nd must now evacuate the rescued battalion through the corridor they've carved in the German defenses, all while under continued enemy pressure. The Germans attempt to cut off the withdrawal, counterattacking along the flanks of the narrow corridor. The 442nd fights desperate rearguard actions, protecting the evacuation of the lost battalion while managing their own casualties and exhaustion. When the combined force finally reaches friendly lines on October 31st, the cost of the rescue becomes clear. The 442nd began the operation with approximately 2,000 men. They suffered over 800 casualties during the 5 days of fighting, with more than 200 killed. They sacrificed more men rescuing the lost battalion than the number of men they rescued. The lost battalion numbered fewer than 220 survivors from the original 275. The mathematics of the rescue are brutal and raise questions that will haunt both the rescued and the rescuers. The soldiers of the 442nd are beyond exhausted. Some have been fighting continuously for 5 days with minimal food, water, or rest. They've pushed themselves past any reasonable limit of human endurance. When they finally stop and the adrenaline fades, many simply collapse where they stand, too tired even to seek shelter or food. Medics move among them, treating wounds that soldiers ignored during the fighting, identifying those who need immediate evacuation to hospitals. The rescue of the lost battalion becomes instant headline news across America. Newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrate the heroism of the Japanese-American soldiers who risked everything to save their fellow Americans. The story is too dramatic, too inspiring, for even the most prejudiced media to ignore. Finally, the 442nd is getting the recognition they've earned. But that recognition is tinged with the enormous cost they paid for it. Medals, recognition, and losses. The aftermath of the Lost Battalion rescue transforms the 442nd's public image and military reputation. Before the rescue, they were a curiosity, a unit of Japanese-American soldiers whose loyalty was still questioned by many. After the rescue, they're heroes, their courage and sacrifice undeniable even to those who previously doubted them. Military commanders praise their performance. Newspaper editorials celebrate their heroism. The soldiers receive medals and commendations at an unprecedented rate. But recognition comes with complex emotions for the survivors. They're proud of what they accomplished, proud that they proved Japanese-American loyalty beyond any doubt. But that pride is inseparable from grief for the friends and comrades who didn't survive. The medals and ceremonies feel hollow when so many who deserved recognition aren't alive to receive it. The soldiers understand that they've achieved their goal of proving Japanese-American worth, but the price paid raises painful questions about whether that proof should have been necessary. The medal ceremonies begin in the field, with commanders pinning decorations on soldiers still wearing dirty combat uniforms. Distinguished service crosses, silver stars, bronze stars, and purple hearts are awarded in numbers that seem almost incomprehensible. The 442nd is becoming one of the most decorated units in American military history. But each medal represents a story of courage, purchased through terrible risk, often involving soldiers who survived when comrades beside them didn't. Private First Class Sadao Munemori, the quiet young man from Los Angeles who demonstrated exceptional courage in the early Italian fighting, receives a posthumous Medal of Honor. In April 1945, during fighting near Seravezza, Italy, Munemori's squad came under heavy fire. He led an assault that destroyed 2 German machine gun positions, but when a German grenade landed among his squad members, Munemori threw himself on it, absorbing the blast with his body. His sacrifice saved 2 fellow soldiers' lives. His mother, Nawa Munemori, still living in the internment camp when she receives the news, faces the unbearable reality that her son died, proving his loyalty to the country that imprisoned her. The story of Sadao Munemori becomes emblematic of the in-text 442nd sacrifice and the larger tragedy of the internment. Here was a young man who volunteered from behind barbed wire, who fought courageously for his country, who made the ultimate sacrifice, all while his mother remained imprisoned. The irony and injustice are so stark that even the most ardent supporters of internment struggle to defend the policy in the face of such sacrifice. Munemori's Medal of Honor, presented to his mother at a ceremony after her release from the camp, becomes a symbol of both heroism and national shame. But Munemori is just one name among hundreds of casualties. Every soldier who died, every man wounded, has a story and leaves behind grieving families. The telegrams begin arriving at internment camps and at homes where families have been released. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son was killed in action. For Japanese-American families, these telegrams carry multiple layers of pain. Their sons died for a country that treated them as enemies, proving loyalty that should never have been questioned. The emotional toll on surviving soldiers is immense. Combat produces trauma that 1,940 military medicine doesn't fully understand or know how to treat. What will later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder is then called combat fatigue, or shell shock, conditions the military views as temporary weaknesses rather than serious psychological injuries. Soldiers are expected to recover quickly, to move on, to not dwell on what they've experienced. But the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the survivor's guilt don't simply disappear on command. Many soldiers grapple with survivor's guilt, questioning why they survived when friends didn't, replaying moments in their minds, wondering if different decisions could have saved lives. They remember specific faces, specific moments. The soldier who was joking moments before a shell killed him, the friend who called for help that couldn't reach him in time, the squad member who took a bullet that might have hit someone else. These memories become heavy burdens that survivors carry for the rest of their lives. The recognition the 442nd receives includes visits from high-ranking military officials and even political leaders. They're told their sacrifice is appreciated, that their courage has made a difference, that they've proven Japanese-American loyalty beyond any doubt. But for soldiers still dealing with the loss of friends, still recovering from wounds physical and psychological, still angry that their families remain imprisoned, these official recognitions feel inadequate. Words of praise, however sincere, can't restore what was lost or repair what was broken. The unit's casualty rate is staggering. By war's end, the 442nd will have suffered over 9,000 casualties, including over 600 killed, from a unit that never numbered more than 4,000 at any given time. This represents a casualty rate exceeding 200%, meaning that, on average, every position in the unit was filled by a casualty more than twice. The numbers are almost abstract in their horror, but behind each statistic is an individual tragedy, a family destroyed, a future erased. The 100th Battalion, which fought even longer than the 442nd, has its own terrible casualty record. The unit earned the grim nickname Purple Heart Battalion because so many of its members were wounded or killed. The soldiers wear this nickname with pride, but also with profound sadness. Being the Purple Heart Battalion means being exceptionally brave, but it also means experiencing exceptional loss. As the war in Europe continues toward its conclusion, the soldiers of the 442nd participate in additional combat operations, including the final push into Germany itself. Each operation adds to the casualty list. Each battle brings more telegrams to waiting families. The decorations continue to accumulate. The 442nd receives 7 Presidential Unit Citations, the highest unit award possible. Individual soldiers receive thousands of medals, recognizing valor and sacrifice. But recognition doesn't ease the pain or answer the fundamental questions the soldiers carry. Why did they have to prove their loyalty through such extraordinary sacrifice? Why were their families imprisoned while they fought? Why did so many have to die before America would accept them as equals? These questions don't have satisfying answers, and the medals and ceremonies, however well-intentioned, can't provide the justice that should have made such proof unnecessary. The price of glory. The glory earned by the 442nd Regimental Combat Team comes with a price that extends far beyond the battlefield casualties, beyond the medals and citations, into the very souls of the men who served, and the families who waited for them. The true cost of their service can't be measured in statistics alone. Though the statistics are staggering enough, the price must be understood in human terms, in lives cut short, in bodies broken, in minds scarred, in families shattered, in futures that never came to be. Consider the families receiving those dreaded telegrams while still imprisoned behind barbed wire. The cruel irony of learning your son died fighting for American freedom while you remain imprisoned by that same America is almost unbearable. Parents face impossible emotional conflicts. Pride in their son's service and sacrifice, mixed with rage at the country that imprisoned them and took their child. How does a mother grieve when her son died proving a loyalty that should never have been questioned? How does a father accept such loss when the government that asked for his son's sacrifice also stole his business, his home, his dignity? The Masuda family's story illustrates this tragedy. Staff Sergeant Kazuo Masuda, who demonstrated exceptional courage in Italy, is killed in action in August 1944. His family, imprisoned at the Gila River internment camp in Arizona, receives the telegram while still behind barbed wire. Kazuo's sister Mary reads the telegram with hands shaking, then collapses in grief. Their parents, who came to America decades ago seeking opportunity and built a successful farm through hard work, have lost everything: their farm, their freedom, and now their son. The Army will award Kazuo a Distinguished Service Cross for his heroism, but his family would trade every medal ever made to have him back. The soldiers who survive carry their own heavy burdens. Many return from the war with physical injuries that will affect them for the rest of their lives. Men lose limbs, eyesight, mobility. They face painful rehabilitation and the challenge of building civilian lives while dealing with permanent disabilities. The medical care available is basic by modern standards, and many soldiers struggle with chronic pain, limited function, and the psychological impact of permanent injury. These physical wounds are visible reminders of the price they paid. But the invisible wounds are often worse. The psychological trauma of combat is profound and lasting. Soldiers wake screaming from nightmares, reliving battles years after they ended. Loud noises trigger panic attacks, sending them diving for cover that isn't necessary anymore. They struggle with depression, with anger, with emotional numbness. Many turn to alcohol to dull the memories and ease the pain, beginning struggles with addiction that will plague them for decades. The survivor's guilt is particularly acute for veterans of the 442nd. They carry the knowledge that they survived when so many friends didn't, and many struggle with the question of why they lived when better men died. They replay moments in their minds, decisions made in combat, actions taken or not taken, wondering if different choices could have saved lives. This guilt becomes a constant companion, a weight that never fully lifts. Senator Daniel Inouye, who lost his right arm in combat and received the Medal of Honor for actions, will later speak of waking decades after the war, still feeling phantom pain in his missing arm, still dreaming of the combat that took it. His physical wound is a constant reminder of what he and his comrades endured, but he'll acknowledge that the psychological scars run deeper than the physical ones. He speaks of comrades who never fully returned from the war, who struggled with demons only other combat veterans could understand. The soldiers also face the challenge of reintegrating into a society that still views them with suspicion and prejudice despite their service. They return home as decorated war heroes, but many still encounter discrimination and racism. Stores refuse them service, housing developments exclude them, employers won't hire them. They wear uniforms decorated with medals for valor, only to be told they're not welcome. The cognitive dissonance is devastating. They prove their loyalty and worth beyond any reasonable standard, yet they're still treated as less than full Americans. Some veterans struggle with bitter anger at this reality. They paid the highest price their country could ask, lost friends and pieces of themselves, earned recognition and medals, but still face discrimination. The promise was that military service would prove their loyalty and earn acceptance. But for many, that promise proves hollow. They're heroes in parades and ceremonies, but still Japs in everyday life. This broken promise adds another layer of psychological burden to already traumatized men. The families that stayed in the camps while their sons fought faced their own form of trauma. They lived with constant fear for their sons' safety, receiving mail irregularly, sometimes waiting weeks or months to learn if their sons were alive or dead. Every knock on the door might bring a telegram announcing the worst news imaginable. This prolonged anxiety, combined with the injustice of imprisonment and the loss of homes and livelihoods, creates its own lasting damage. The younger siblings and children who grew up in the camps carry their own scars. They experience formative years behind barbed wire, learning to view armed guards and watch towers as normal parts of life. Many grow up without fully understanding why they're imprisoned, developing a deep sense of shame about their Japanese heritage despite having done nothing wrong. They watch their parents' anguish and their brothers' sacrifice, absorbing trauma even if they don't fully comprehend it at the time. The economic cost compounds the human tragedy. Japanese-American families lost an estimated $400 million in property and income due to internment, equivalent to several billion in today's currency. Businesses built over decades vanished. Farms and homes were sold for pennies or simply taken. Generational wealth accumulated through hard work and sacrifice simply evaporated. The soldiers of the 442nd fought while their families' economic futures were being destroyed, adding financial devastation to the physical and psychological trauma. For soldiers whose families lost everything, the burden of rebuilding after the war is immense. They return from combat, often wounded or traumatized, to find their families homeless, destitute, dependent on them for support. Instead of having time to recover and heal, they must immediately begin the work of economic survival. Many postpone or abandon educational plans, taking whatever jobs they can find to support families left impoverished by internment. Their sacrifice continues long after the fighting ends. The cost extends to relationships and families torn apart by the war and internment. The stress of combat, the trauma of imprisonment, the economic devastation, all these factors strain marriages and family bonds. Some soldiers return so changed by combat that they struggle to connect with family members. Others find that years of separation have created unbridgeable emotional distance. The divorce rate among 442nd veterans is high, another casualty of the war rarely counted in official statistics. Some veterans find it impossible to talk about their experiences. They come home and lock away their memories, refusing to discuss what they saw or did, unable to share the burden with people who weren't there. This silence creates emotional distance from loved ones who want to understand and help, but are kept at arm's length. Wives and children of veterans grow up knowing their husband or father fought in the war, but never really understanding what that meant or how it affected him. The "go for broke" motto that inspired such courage also exacted a terrible price. The determination to prove Japanese American worth through exceptional performance led to accepting casualty rates that should have been unacceptable. The 442nd's casualty rate of over 200% means the unit was essentially destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Such losses would normally result in a unit being pulled from combat for rest and reconstitution, but the 442nd kept fighting because they felt they had to keep proving themselves. This raises uncomfortable questions about whether military commanders exploited the 442nd's determination to prove themselves, assigning them disproportionately dangerous missions because they knew these soldiers would accept tasks others might refuse. Were the soldiers of the 442nd given the most difficult assignments because commanders respected their abilities, or because these soldiers were considered more expendable? The answer is probably some complex mixture of both, but the question itself reveals how the need to prove loyalty created conditions where excessive sacrifice became normalized. The legacy of this sacrifice is complicated. On one hand, the 442nd Service did help advance Japanese American civil rights. Their courage made it harder to justify discrimination and helped pave the way for the end of internment and the gradual improvement of Japanese American legal and social status. On the other hand, the fact that such extraordinary sacrifice was necessary to secure basic rights reveals profound injustice. No other American community had to earn their rights through such bloodshed. Fade to black as the camera shows a military cemetery in Italy. Rows of white crosses marking the graves of soldiers who never came home. Their sacrifice, both glorious and tragic, necessary and unjust, heroic and heartbreaking. Returning to a distrustful America, fade in on the spring of 1946. World War II has ended, first in Europe and then in the Pacific. The soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team are finally coming home after years of combat in Italy, France, and Germany. They board ships at European ports, decorated war heroes returning to the country they nearly died defending. They wear uniforms heavy with medals, distinguished service crosses, silver stars, bronze stars, purple hearts. They are, by any objective measure, among the most heroic and decorated soldiers in American military history. But the America they're returning to is not the grateful, transformed nation they hoped their sacrifice might create. The reception begins, promisingly enough. In July 1946, President Harry S. Truman reviews the 442nd on the White House lawn, one of the few times an entire military unit receives such an honor. Truman addresses the assembled soldiers, his words carefully chosen and surprisingly forthright. "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you have won. Keep up that fight, and we will continue to win to make this great republic stand for just what the Constitution says it stands for: the welfare of all the people all the time." Truman's words acknowledge both the soldiers' military achievements and the discrimination they faced. It's a rare moment of official recognition that their battle extended beyond the battlefield. that proving their loyalty required fighting on two fronts. The soldiers stand at attention in their dress uniforms, pride mixed with complex emotions. They appreciate the recognition. But Truman's words also underscore a bitter reality. They had to fight prejudice through bloodshed, had to earn through extraordinary sacrifice what should have been their birthright as American citizens. But presidential ceremonies don't change the reality most veterans will face when they return to civilian life. As soldiers disperse from Washington, D.C. to their home communities across America, particularly on the West Coast, where most Japanese Americans lived before the war, they encounter a nation that hasn't fully moved past its wartime prejudices. The hero's welcome they might have expected is often notably absent, replaced by continued suspicion, discrimination, and in some cases, outright hostility. Many veterans return to find their families still struggling to rebuild lives shattered by internment. The camps have closed, but families released from them face enormous challenges. They have no homes to return to. Many were sold or stolen during internment. They have no businesses, stores, and farms they built over decades are gone. They have no savings, bank accounts were frozen or depleted. They're starting over from nothing, in a society that still views them with suspicion, trying to rebuild in middle age or old age what took lifetimes to create. The veterans themselves face direct discrimination despite their service and decorations. Kazuo Masuda's family story illustrates this cruel reality. After Kazuo was killed in action and posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, his family tried to return to their California home after being released from the camp. But neighbors, the same people who had lived alongside them for years before the war, greeted them with hostility. A group of local residents formed a committee opposing the Masudas' return, arguing that Japanese Americans weren't welcome regardless of their or their sons' sacrifices. The confrontation might have escalated into violence had not an unlikely ally intervened. Actor Ronald Reagan, then a relatively unknown Hollywood figure, learned of the Masuda situation and traveled to their town to speak on their behalf. At a public meeting, Reagan confronted the anti-Japanese committee, holding up Kazuo's Distinguished Service Cross and asking, what greater contribution can a man make than to give his life for his country? His intervention helped diffuse the immediate situation, but it shouldn't have been necessary. A family whose son died fighting for America shouldn't need a Hollywood actor to defend their right to come home. Veterans looking for work encounter discriminatory hiring practices. Despite their military experience and decorations, many employers refuse to hire them or offer only menial positions regardless of qualifications. No Jap signs that proliferated during the war haven't all come down. Housing developments use restrictive covenants to exclude Japanese Americans, denying them the opportunity to buy homes in many communities. Banks deny them loans or charge higher interest rates. The message is clear: your service and sacrifice don't entitle you to equal treatment. Some veterans face harassment and violence. Their homes are vandalized with racist graffiti. Shots are fired at houses where Japanese American families live. Veterans wearing their uniforms in public are sometimes confronted with slurs and threats. The cognitive dissonance is devastating. They're wearing uniforms decorated for valor, displaying medals earned through sacrifice. Yet they're still treated as enemies, still viewed as less than fully American. Daniel Inoue, the future senator who lost his arm in combat and received the Medal of Honor, experiences this discrimination firsthand. Returning to Hawaii, he enters a barbershop in his army uniform, his empty right sleeve and chest full of decorations clearly visible. The barber takes one look at him and says, "We don't cut Jap hair." Inoue, who literally gave his arm for his country, is denied service because of his face. He'll later describe this moment as one of the most painful of his life, more emotionally devastating than losing his arm in combat. The veterans also struggle with the psychological adjustment to civilian life, a challenge all combat veterans face, but one complicated by their unique circumstances. They're dealing with combat trauma, what we now call PTSD. But what 1,940 seconds America largely ignores or dismisses. They have nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt, but they also carry the additional burden of having fought for a country that imprisoned their families, that continues to discriminate against them, that required them to prove a loyalty that should never have been questioned. Many veterans find it difficult or impossible to talk about their experiences. How do you explain to civilians what combat was like? How do you describe watching friends die, killing enemy soldiers, living with constant fear and adrenaline? And how do you explain the complexity of fighting for a country that treated you as an enemy, of proving your loyalty while your family remained imprisoned? The burden is often too heavy to share, so veterans remain silent, carrying their trauma alone. Some veterans turn to each other for support, forming organizations and gathering regularly to share experiences with people who understand. These gatherings become crucial support networks, spaces where veterans can be honest about their struggles without judgment. They talk about the war, about the discrimination they face, about the challenge of building lives after so much loss. These connections, forged in combat and sustained through shared struggle, become lifelines for men navigating a difficult return to civilian life. Others struggle in isolation, unable or unwilling to connect with fellow veterans, dealing with their trauma and anger alone. Some turn to alcohol to numb the pain and quiet the memories. Others throw themselves into work, staying busy to avoid thinking about what they experienced. Still others simply withdraw, becoming ghosts in their own families, physically present but emotionally distant. The casualty rate of the 442nd doesn't end when the war does. It continues in the broken lives and struggled adjustments of veterans trying to find peace. The families of those who didn't return face their own difficult adjustment. Gold Star families, those who lost sons in the war, must navigate grief while also dealing with the practical challenges of rebuilding after internment. Many mothers and fathers lost their sons while imprisoned, a compounded trauma that's difficult for anyone outside that experience to fully comprehend. They grieve not just for their lost children, but for the injustice that made such sacrifice necessary. The government offers little support for Japanese American families dealing with the aftermath of internment and military service. There are no special programs to help families rebuild businesses or replace lost property. The financial compensation for internment-related losses, when it eventually comes, is grossly inadequate. Pennies on the dollar for everything that was lost. Veterans receive the same GI Bill benefits as other soldiers, which helps many pursue education and start businesses. But these benefits can't replace what internment destroyed. Despite all these challenges, many veterans and their families persevere. They use GI Bill benefits to attend college, often becoming the first in their families to receive higher education. They start businesses, buy homes where possible, raise families. They're determined to build better lives, to make their sacrifices meaningful by succeeding despite continued discrimination. But success requires extraordinary resilience. And the cost of that resilience, the emotional toll of constantly having to prove yourself, to overcome barriers that shouldn't exist, is difficult to measure but impossible to dismiss. Civil rights ripple effects. The service and sacrifice of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team creates ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate post-war period, influencing civil rights developments and changing American attitudes about race, loyalty, and citizenship in ways both profound and subtle. The veterans themselves often don't recognize the broader historical significance of their actions while they're living through them, but historians and civil rights activists will later identify the 442nd story as a crucial chapter in America's long struggle toward equality. The most immediate impact comes in the legal and political realm. The stark contradiction between imprisoning Japanese Americans and celebrating the heroism of Japanese American soldiers becomes increasingly difficult to defend. How can the government justify treating people as dangerous enemies when their sons are dying to prove American loyalty? How can discrimination be sustained when Japanese Americans have demonstrated courage and patriotism exceeding any reasonable standard? These questions don't have satisfying answers, and the cognitive dissonance they create becomes a catalyst for change. In 1948, President Truman issues Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. military. While this order primarily addresses racial segregation of black soldiers, it's influenced by the success of units like the 442nd, which demonstrated that racial minorities could serve with exceptional distinction. The 442nd's record provides ammunition for arguments that segregation and discrimination waste talent and undermine American ideals. The order doesn't immediately end all military segregation, but it establishes the principle that military service and ability should be judged without regard to race or ancestry. The 442nd story also influences immigration and naturalization law. Before World War II, Asian immigrants were prohibited from becoming naturalized citizens through explicitly racist immigration laws. The 1790 Naturalization Act limited citizenship to free white persons, and subsequent legislation extended this to African Americans, but continued excluding Asians. Japanese immigrants, the Issei parents of Nisei soldiers, couldn't become citizens regardless of how long they lived in America or how much they contributed to American society. This injustice becomes harder to sustain after the war. How can America deny citizenship to the parents of soldiers who died fighting for the country? How can the government tell a Gold Star mother she's not worthy of citizenship in the nation her son gave his life defending? The contradiction is too stark to ignore. In 1952, Congress passes the Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the McCarran-Walter Act, which finally allows Japanese and other Asian immigrants to naturalize. It's a significant victory, though one that comes far too late for many who waited decades for recognition. The 442nd Service also influences the broader civil rights movement, providing a template and inspiration for other minorities fighting for equality. African American civil rights leaders take note of how Japanese Americans used military service to challenge discrimination and advance their civil rights claims. While the circumstances differ, African Americans were never subjected to mass internment, but faced a longer and more pervasive system of segregation and discrimination. There are parallels in using military service to claim full citizenship rights. Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP legal strategist, who will later argue Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court, studies cases involving Japanese American rights, including legal challenges to internment. While these challenges largely failed during the war, they establish legal arguments and precedents that civil rights lawyers will later adapt for challenges to segregation. The fundamental argument that the Constitution guarantees equal protection regardless of race applies across different forms of racial discrimination. The 442nd story also influences public opinion in ways that create political space for civil rights advances. Americans who might have resisted ending discrimination begin reconsidering their positions when confronted with the courage and sacrifice of Japanese American soldiers. It's harder to maintain irrational prejudice when faced with evidence that contradicts stereotypes. While this doesn't end discrimination, prejudice is remarkably resilient, even in the face of contradictory evidence. It does shift the acceptable boundaries of public discourse. Newspapers and magazines that promoted anti-Japanese hysteria during the war begin running more sympathetic stories about Japanese American veterans and families. The narrative shifts from portraying Japanese Americans as dangerous enemies to celebrating them as loyal Americans who overcame injustice. This shift isn't universal or immediate, and it often carries condescending undertones, the model minority stereotype that will later prove problematic. But it does represent progress from the virulent racism of the war years. In California and other West Coast states, where most Japanese Americans lived before the war, the 442nd Service influences political debates about property rights and discrimination. State legislatures that passed laws restricting Japanese Americans' rights to own land or operate businesses face increasing pressure to repeal these discriminatory statutes. While change comes slowly, the war record of Japanese American soldiers makes it harder for politicians to defend explicitly racist laws. The educational system also begins changing. Textbooks that ignored or stereotyped Japanese Americans start including more balanced treatment, sometimes even highlighting the 442nd service. Schools that excluded Japanese American students or segregated them into separate facilities face challenges based partly on the argument that children of veterans deserve better. These changes are gradual and incomplete, but they represent movement toward a more inclusive understanding of American identity. The 442nd's legacy influences Asian American identity and political consciousness more broadly. The soldiers' service demonstrates that Asian Americans belong in America, that they're willing to fight and die for American ideals, that they're not perpetual foreigners but integral parts of American society. This demonstration helps subsequent generations of Asian Americans claim space in American public life, enter politics, demand equal treatment, and resist discrimination. However, the 442nd's legacy also creates complications and tensions within the Asian American community. The model minority stereotype that emerges partly from celebrating the 442nd service can be used to dismiss legitimate grievances and mask continuing discrimination. The narrative of Japanese Americans overcoming injustice through hard work and military service sometimes becomes a weapon against other minorities, suggesting that if Japanese Americans could succeed despite discrimination, other groups have only themselves to blame for their circumstances. Some younger Japanese Americans, particularly those coming of age in the 1960s and 1970s, grapple with complicated feelings about the 442nd's legacy. They admire their fathers' and grandfathers' courage, but question whether such extraordinary sacrifice should have been necessary to secure basic rights. They wonder if the veterans' willingness to serve despite injustice inadvertently validated that injustice, if their compliance made it easier for the government to maintain internment. These questions aren't meant to diminish the veterans' courage, but to examine the broader systems that made such courage necessary. The civil rights movement of the 1960s influences how Japanese Americans understand their own history. Younger activists begin challenging the quiet acceptance approach that characterized many Japanese Americans' response to internment. They argue for more vocal demands for justice, for reparations, for official acknowledgement of the government's wrongdoing. They see parallels between the Japanese American experience and other civil rights struggles, building coalitions across racial and ethnic lines to fight discrimination. This activism eventually leads to the redress movement, which seeks official acknowledgement of internment's injustice and compensation for survivors. Veterans of the 442nd play crucial roles in this movement, their service providing moral authority for demands that the government acknowledge its mistakes. Their argument is powerful. We proved our loyalty through extraordinary sacrifice. The least the government can do is admit that our imprisonment was unjust and provide some measure of compensation for what was lost. Recognition at last. The full recognition of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team's extraordinary service and sacrifice comes slowly, developing over decades as American society gradually confronts the injustice of internment and acknowledges the courage of those who served despite that injustice. This recognition takes many forms: official governmental acknowledgments, public memorials, educational initiatives, and popular culture representations. Each form of recognition carries its own significance and limitations, celebrating heroism while sometimes obscuring the deeper questions about justice and citizenship that the 442nd story raises. The first major step toward comprehensive recognition comes in the 1970s, as the civil rights movement's influence encourages Japanese Americans to speak more openly about their wartime experiences. For decades after the war, many Japanese Americans including veterans, maintained a stoic silence about internment and military service. Cultural values emphasizing not bringing shame to the community, combined with a desire to move forward rather than dwell on past injustices, kept many stories private. But as younger Japanese Americans begin asking questions and demanding answers, veterans start sharing their experiences more publicly. In 1976, President Gerald Ford formally rescinds Executive Order 9066, the order that authorized Japanese American internment. Ford's proclamation acknowledges that internment was wrong, stating, "We now know what we should have known then. Not only was that evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans." The proclamation is significant as an official governmental acknowledgement of injustice, but it's also limited. It comes over 30 years after the war ended, after many internees and veterans have already died, and it doesn't include any compensation or concrete remedies for the harm done. The push for more substantial recognition intensifies through the late 1970s and 1980s. Japanese American community organizations, civil rights groups, and sympathetic politicians advocate for a formal government investigation into internment. In 1980, Congress establishes the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians to examine the circumstances and impact of internment. The commission holds hearings across the country, providing a platform for internment survivors and veterans to share their stories publicly. The testimonies at these hearings are powerful and emotional. Elderly veterans, many speaking publicly about their experiences for the first time, describe fighting for their country while their families were imprisoned. They talk about receiving medals while receiving letters from parents behind barbed wire. They cry as they remember friends who died, proving loyalty that should never have been questioned. Former internees describe the loss of homes, businesses, dignity, and years of their lives. These testimonies create a comprehensive public record of internment's injustice and its lasting impact. In 1983, the Commission releases its report, Personal Justice Denied, which concludes, unequivocally, that internment was not justified by military necessity, but resulted from race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The report recommends that the government issue a formal apology and provide monetary compensation to surviving internees. The report's clear language and thorough documentation make it difficult for anyone to continue defending internment as a necessary wartime measure. The push for redress legislation faces significant political obstacles. Some politicians and citizens resist the idea of apologizing or paying compensation for decisions made during wartime. They argue that internment, while regrettable, was a reasonable response to perceived security threats. But the 442nd service record becomes a powerful counter-argument. How can anyone claim Japanese Americans posed a security threat when their sons were dying for America? How can internment be defended when it imprisoned the families of the most decorated unit in American military history? In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signs the Civil Liberties Act, which provides a formal governmental apology and monetary compensation of $20,000 to each surviving internee. Reagan's remarks at the signing ceremony explicitly reference the 442nd. Blood that has soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color. America stands unique in the world. The only country not founded on race but on a way, an ideal. Not in spite of but because of our polyglot background, we have had all the strength in the world. That is the American way. Reagan's statement, delivered by the same man who once defended the Masuda family's right to return home, represents a significant moment of official recognition. The Civil Liberties Act acknowledges governmental wrongdoing, provides tangible compensation, and validates the experiences of internment survivors and veterans. However, many observe that $20,000 is grossly inadequate compensation for years of imprisonment and generational wealth lost. It's a symbolic acknowledgement more than genuine restitution. but it's also meaningful as an official recognition of injustice. The recognition of the 442nd's specific military contributions also expands during this period. In 2000, Congress reviews the military records of Asian American veterans from World War II and identifies instances where racial prejudice may have prevented proper recognition. The review focuses particularly on the 442nd and other Japanese American units, examining cases where soldiers may have deserved but didn't receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The review concludes that racial discrimination did affect medal decisions, with Japanese American soldiers held to higher standards than white soldiers. In June 2000, President Bill Clinton awards the Medal of Honor to 21 Asian American veterans of World War II, including 20 from the 442nd and 1 from another Japanese American unit. Most of the medals are posthumous, the recipients having died in the decades since the war. The ceremony is emotional, with elderly survivors and families of deceased soldiers receiving recognition that should have come 55 years earlier. Senator Daniel Inouye, who lost his arm in combat and previously received the Distinguished Service Cross, is among those whose decoration is upgraded to the Medal of Honor. At the ceremony, Inouye is characteristically humble, insisting that he's accepting the medal on behalf of all who served. "I'm not a hero. I just did what I was told to do." His humility is touching, but also somewhat frustrating to those who believe he and his comrades deserve to celebrate their courage without qualification or modesty. Public memorials to the 442nd begin appearing across the country. In Los Angeles, a memorial plaza honors Japanese American veterans. In Hawaii, monuments commemorate the 442nd and 100th Battalion. The National Japanese American Memorial to Patriotism is dedicated in Washington, D.C. in 2000, featuring a bronze sculpture and inscriptions honoring Japanese Americans who served and those who were interned. These physical memorials ensure that future generations will encounter the 442nd story and the broader history of Japanese American wartime experiences. Educational initiatives also expand recognition. Schools begin teaching about internment and the 442nd as part of World War II and civil rights curricula. Documentaries, books, and films tell the story to wider audiences. The PBS documentary, Honor and Sacrifice, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, brings the veteran stories to national television. Books like Just Americans, How Japanese Americans Won a War at Home and Abroad provide comprehensive histories accessible to general readers. In 2010, Congress awards the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the 100th Infantry Battalion, and the Military Intelligence Service, recognizing Japanese American contributions to World War II victory. The ceremony brings together surviving veterans, now in their 80s and 90s, for a final major official recognition. President Barack Obama delivers remarks praising their service and acknowledging the injustice they overcame. "In the face of impossible odds, you vanquished a terrible enemy, and in the process, you helped America come to know itself." The recognition also extends internationally. France awards the Legion of Honor to veterans who fought in French territory, including those who participated in the Lost Battalion rescue. Italy honors the 442nd for their service liberating Italian towns and villages. These international recognitions acknowledge that the 442nd service benefited not just America, but all the Allied nations fighting against fascism. Yet, even as recognition accumulates, some veterans express ambivalence. They appreciate the acknowledgement, but note that it comes so late that many comrades didn't live to see it. They're grateful for the honors, but remain frustrated that such extraordinary proof of loyalty was necessary in the first place. They're proud of their service, but angry about internment. These complex, sometimes contradictory emotions reflect the complexity of the 442nd story itself, one of both heroism and injustice, of loyalty and betrayal, of service and sacrifice that should never have been necessary. Why their story matters today. As we move further from World War II, the question becomes, why does the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team matter today? Why should contemporary Americans care about events that occurred over 75 years ago? The answer lies in the timeless themes the 442nd story embodies. Questions about loyalty and citizenship, about prejudice and justice, about who gets to be fully American and what that means. These questions remain relevant because they recur in different forms across American history, including our present moment. The most obvious contemporary relevance relates to how America treats minorities, particularly during times of perceived national threat. The pattern that led to Japanese-American internment, fear plus prejudice plus political opportunism, didn't end with World War II. In the decades since, America has repeatedly witnessed similar dynamics. Suspicion of Muslim Americans after 9/11, targeting of Hispanic Americans in debates over immigration, discrimination against Asian Americans during COVID-19. The specifics differ, but the underlying pattern of scapegoating minorities during times of fear remains disturbingly consistent. After the 11th of September 2001 terrorist attacks, many Japanese Americans recognized disturbing parallels with their own historical experience. Muslim Americans faced suspicion, harassment, and discrimination based on their faith and ethnicity. Some politicians proposed creating registries of Muslims or conducting enhanced surveillance of Muslim communities. Japanese Americans who remembered internment spoke out against these proposals, using their historical experience to warn against repeating past mistakes. Veterans of the 442nd and survivors of internment testified before Congress, wrote op-eds, and participated in public forums arguing that America must not repeat injustices of World War II. They formed coalitions with Muslim American organizations, sharing their experiences and offering solidarity. The message was clear. We know where suspicion and fear can lead. We've experienced the injustice of being viewed as enemies because of our ancestry. We won't stand by while another community faces similar treatment. This activism by Japanese American elders demonstrates one way the 442nd's legacy matters today, as a moral witness and warning against collective punishment and discrimination. The fact that America imprisoned Japanese Americans based on racial prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns, even as their sons died proving loyalty, stands as a powerful indictment of policies that treat entire communities as suspect based on the actions of a few individuals from their ethnic or religious background. The 442nd story also speaks to continuing questions about what it means to be American, about who belongs and who gets to define belonging. The soldiers of the 442nd were American citizens by birth, yet they had to prove their Americanness through extraordinary sacrifice. This dynamic minority is having to demonstrate their loyalty more than the majority population didn't end with World War II. Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, Muslim Americans, and other minorities still face questions about their loyalty, still encounter the assumption that they're foreigners, even when their families have been in America for generations. The question, "Where are you from?" seems innocent, but carries different weight depending on who's being asked. When asked of white Americans, it's a simple question about hometown or state. When asked of Asian Americans, it often carries an implicit assumption of foreignness, an implication that they're not really from here, that they belong somewhere else. Many Asian Americans report being asked where they're really from, with the questioner unsatisfied with answers like California or New York, assuming there must be some foreign origin that explains their appearance. This experience of being perpetually viewed as foreign, of having one's Americanness questioned, connects directly to the 442nd story. These soldiers were as American as anyone, yet they had to prove it through blood. Their descendants are as American as anyone, yet they still face questions about their loyalty, their belonging, their right to be here. The 442nd fought, hoping that their sacrifice would end such questions. But those questions persist in different forms. The story also matters for what it teaches about courage and principle. The soldiers of the 442nd made a choice to serve despite injustice, to fight for American ideals, even when America failed to live up to those ideals for them. This wasn't naive patriotism or blind loyalty, but a conscious decision to stake a claim to citizenship, to insist through their service that they belonged, that they were Americans, regardless of how they were treated. Their courage wasn't just physical bravery in combat, but moral courage in insisting on their rights and worth despite everything. This example of moral courage remains relevant. Americans today face different but equally complex questions about how to respond to injustice, how to insist on rights and dignity when systems deny them, how to maintain faith in democratic ideals when those ideals aren't realized in practice. The 442nd's veterans don't provide simple answers. Their own feelings about their choices were often complex and conflicted, but they model a form of principled engagement, of fighting for what should be while dealing with what is. The redress movement that eventually secured acknowledgement of internment's injustice also offers lessons for contemporary civil rights struggles. The path from internment to apology and compensation took over 40 years and required sustained activism, coalition building, political organizing, and refusal to accept injustice. The success wasn't inevitable or easy, but resulted from determined effort by multiple generations working together. This history provides both inspiration and practical lessons for communities seeking justice today. The story matters for education and historical memory. Surveys consistently show that many Americans know little about internment or the 442nd. This ignorance isn't accidental but reflects decisions about what history gets taught, what stories get told, whose experiences matter. Including the 442nd's story in American history, education doesn't just honor the veterans. It provides a more complete and honest account of American history, one that includes both the nation's failures and the courage of those who fought to overcome those failures. Teaching this history also combats the mythology of World War II as the good war, where America fought purely for democracy and freedom. World War II was a necessary war against genuine evil in the form of fascism, and Americans sacrificed tremendously to win it. But even as America fought fascism abroad, it practiced racial injustice at home, imprisoning citizens based on ancestry and maintaining segregation throughout society. Acknowledging this complexity produces a more mature and accurate historical understanding. The 442nd story also matters for what it reveals about the costs of prejudice and discrimination. When America imprisoned Japanese Americans, it wasted the talents and contributions of a productive community. When it initially refused to let Japanese Americans serve in the military, it wasted the potential contributions of soldiers who would prove to be exceptionally capable. Prejudice doesn't just harm its targets, it wastes human potential and makes society worse for everyone. The 442nd's achievements demonstrate what's possible when people are given opportunities despite discrimination. Imagine what more could be achieved if people didn't face discrimination in the first place. For Asian Americans specifically, the 442nd story remains a crucial part of community history and identity. The soldiers' courage provides a source of pride and inspiration. Their sacrifice demonstrated Asian Americans' belonging and commitment to American ideals. Their story complicates the model minority stereotype, showing both the costs of that stereotype and the reality that Asian Americans had to fight for acceptance rather than simply being accepted. However, the story also raises difficult questions within Asian American communities. Was the 442nd service a victory or a tragedy? Did their willingness to serve despite internment validate the government's unjust actions? Should they have resisted more forcefully? These questions don't have simple answers, but wrestling with them is part of how communities process historical trauma and consider how to respond to contemporary challenges. For America as a whole, the 442nd story serves as both inspiration and indictment. It's inspiring that these soldiers served with such courage and distinction, that they maintained faith in American ideals despite experiencing American injustice. But it's also an indictment that such proof of loyalty was necessary, that citizens had to earn through extraordinary sacrifice what should have been their birthright. America should celebrate the 442nd's heroism, while also acknowledging and learning from the injustice that made such heroism necessary. As the last veterans of the 442nd pass away, the youngest are now in their late 90s, the responsibility for remembering and learning from their story passes to subsequent generations. Their story must be told and retold, taught in schools, commemorated in memorials, kept alive in public memory, not just to honor the veterans, though they deserve honor, but to ensure that the lessons of their experience inform how America treats minorities today and in the future. The story matters because history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future. The patterns that led to internment, fear, prejudice, political opportunism remain present in American society. The question of who gets to be fully American remains contested. The challenge of responding to injustice with principle and courage remains relevant. The 442nd story provides historical context for these contemporary issues and offers both warnings about the consequences of prejudice and examples of courage in confronting injustice. Fade out on images of the 442nd Memorial in Washington, D.C., where bronze sculptures of soldiers stand eternal watch, their sacrifice frozen in metal, their story preserved for generations to come. The memorial's inscription reads, "The lessons learned must remain as a grave reminder of what we must not allow to happen again to any group." This is why their story matters, not just to remember the past, but to shape a more just future. The story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team is a uniquely American story, embodying both the nation's highest ideals and its deepest failings. It's a story of courage and sacrifice, of loyalty and betrayal, of justice delayed and recognition hard won. It's a story that challenges simple narratives about American history, forcing confrontation with uncomfortable truths about racism, discrimination, and the conditional nature of citizenship for minorities. The veterans of the 442nd are heroes, not despite the injustice they faced, but in the fullest sense precisely because they maintained their principles and served with distinction despite that injustice. They didn't fight for the America that existed, which imprisoned their families and discriminated against them. They fought for the America that should exist, the nation of the Constitution's promises and the Declaration of Independence's ideals. Their service brought progress toward that ideal America, though the price was tragically high. Japanese Americans' legal and social status improved after the war, partly because the 442nd made discrimination harder to defend. But the fact that such extraordinary sacrifice was necessary to secure basic rights stands as an enduring indictment of American injustice. Today, as America continues grappling with questions of race, citizenship, loyalty, and belonging, the 442nd story remains powerfully relevant. It's a reminder that prejudice is not just morally wrong, but practically destructive, wasting human potential and undermining national unity. It's a warning that fear and hysteria can lead even democracies to commit grave injustices. And it's an inspiration, showing that individuals and communities can maintain dignity, principle, and courage even in the face of systematic injustice. The forgotten heroes of the 442nd aren't forgotten anymore. Their story has been told, their service recognized, their sacrifice honored. But the work of learning from their experience, of applying the lessons of their story to contemporary challenges, continues. Every generation must decide what it means to be American, who belongs, what we owe each other. The 442nd story, properly understood, informs those decisions, and challenges us to build a nation worthy of the sacrifices made in its name. When the guns fell silent and the war was over, the soldiers of the 442nd returned home, draped in medals, but still scarred by prejudice. They had liberated towns, rescued battalions, and proven their loyalty in ways few could ever match. And yet, many of them stepped off ships and trains only to face the same barbed wire fences that had caged their families during the war. Their triumph abroad did not erase the injustice at home. For decades, their sacrifice was overlooked. Their medals gathered dust, their stories pushed to the margins of history books. But memory has a way of fighting back, just as fiercely as the men of the 442nd fought on European soil. Slowly, America began to reckon with its past. In 1988, the U.S. government issued a formal apology to Japanese Americans who had been imprisoned. In later years, many soldiers of the 442nd received the medals of honor they had long been denied. But even recognition cannot undo what was endured. It cannot restore lost childhoods, stolen businesses, or the dignity stripped away behind barbed wire. What it can do, what we can do, is carry forward the lessons they left us. The 442nd proved that courage is not born from comfort. It is born from hardship, from injustice, from the decision to stand tall even when your country pushes you down. They proved that loyalty is not a matter of race or ancestry. It is a matter of choice, a matter of heart. Today, their story speaks louder than ever. In times when fear and suspicion divide us, when voices try to mark some as less American than others, we must remember the men who volunteered to fight for a nation that doubted them. We must remember the families who endured the camps. We must remember that patriotism is not blind obedience, it is sacrifice, it is service, and it is love for ideals that are greater than prejudice. The legacy of the 442nd is not just a chapter of World War II. It is a lesson for every generation. A reminder that the measure of a nation is not how it treats those it trusts, but how it treats those it fears. And perhaps the greatest tribute we can pay these forgotten heroes is to ensure that no community is ever again forced to prove its loyalty through suffering. If this story moved you, if you believe history must be remembered in full, both the glory and the shame, then help us keep these voices alive. Subscribe, share this story, and join us as we continue bringing to light the histories that should never be forgotten. Together, we honor their sacrifice, and together, we make sure that the next generation will not forget the forgotten heroes who still fought for America. Because memory is resistance, and remembrance is justice.